Wildwood, Colorado, was a town where secrets rarely stayed hidden for long. Nestled at the base of the Rocky Mountains, it was a postcard-perfect community of large homes, pristine lawns, and families that seemed, on the surface, to have everything together. But underneath the quiet, unassuming streets, darkness lurked in places few dared to look. For Imogen Mercer, that darkness was about to consume her life. At 42, Imogen had built a life many would envy. She was a health consultant with a respected practice in town, her clients drawn to her warmth and sense of calm. She had been married to Gareth Mercer, a construction entrepreneur, for 15 years. Gareth was 53, successful, and well regarded in the community, though his demeanor had always been a little too severe for some people's comfort. His cold, calculating eyes, hidden behind a facade of charm, gave him the air of someone who thrived on control. Then there was Evie, Imogen's daughter from her first marriage. At 21, Evie was in her final year of college, an art major whose talent had been the talk of her professors. She was the kind of person who exuded mystery, her intensity, her aloofness, her frequent need for solitude. Evie and Gareth never got along. Since Imogen had remarried, their interactions had always been strained. But now, something in the house had shifted, and the tension between them had become palpable. Imogen, sensitive to the subtleties in her family, couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. Evie spent most of her time locked away in her room, working on her latest art project. Imogen used to think her daughter's isolation was simply part of her creative process. But lately, she had noticed a darkness in Evie's demeanor that hadn't been there before. Evie avoided eye contact, her once vibrant conversations now reduced to cold, one-word responses. The light in her eyes was fading, replaced by something raw and haunted. Imogen had tried reaching out, but Evie recoiled, as if afraid to let her mother in. Gareth, however, seemed more engaged than usual, lingering near Evie's closed door in ways that made Imogen uncomfortable. His intense gaze followed Evie, even though the two rarely spoke directly. Every moment he spent near Evie sent a ripple of unease through the house. Imogen told herself that it was just the usual friction between a stepfather and his stepdaughter. But a deeper part of her, a part she didn't want to admit, knew something more was festering beneath the surface. The evening that changed everything began like any other. Imogen had prepared dinner, the rhythmic sound of the kitchen knife against the cutting board calming her nerves. Gareth sat in his usual chair by the den, pretending to read a newspaper, though his eyes frequently flicked toward the hallway where Evie's room was. The air in the house felt thick, charged with an unseen tension that made Imogen's skin crawl. By the time dinner was served, Evie still hadn't emerged from her room. Imogen knocked softly, then harder. But there was no answer. She debated pushing the door open, but something stopped her, an instinctual fear she couldn't quite explain. Instead, she left a plate outside Evie's door, retreating to the kitchen with a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. After Gareth retreated to his study for the night, claiming he had paperwork, Imogen wandered the house aimlessly, lost in her own thoughts. She tried to shake off the growing sense of dread, telling herself that all families went through periods of strain. But deep down, she knew the cracks in her family were too wide, too dangerous to ignore. She just didn't know how deep they went. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Imogen heard the faintest creak from the hallway. She turned her head toward the sound, her heart quickening. She waited, straining to hear more. There it was again, the soft creak of floorboards under a heavy foot. Gareth, perhaps. She glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. Why would he be wandering the house so late? Silence followed. Imogen held her breath, her mind racing with irrational fears. After several minutes, she convinced herself it was nothing, just the house settling, or Gareth moving something in the study. She rolled over, trying to calm the storm of thoughts in her mind, but sleep didn't come easily. In the morning, Imogen found the untouched dinner plate still outside Evie's door. The sight sent a chill down her spine. Evie hadn't even opened the door to take the food. Had she been in there all night, isolated and alone? Or had she left after Imogen had gone to bed? The thoughts were unsettling, but Imogen brushed them aside, hoping that Evie was just going through another one of her moody phases. But deep down, Imogen knew this wasn't just another mood. Something was wrong. The next few days were filled with more strange occurrences. Imogen noticed Gareth growing increasingly erratic. He spent more time in the house, less at work. When he wasn't in his study, he was in the garage, tinkering with God knows what. And every now and then, Imogen would catch him glancing at Evie's door, his expression distant but focused. He looked like a man who was plotting something, though what, Imogen couldn't tell. On a particularly cold evening, Imogen came home early from work, the wind biting through her coat as she hurried through the front door. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. She set her keys on the table and called out for Gareth. No answer. She tried Evie's door next, knocking softly. Nothing. It was as though the house had swallowed them both whole. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from Lydia Westfield, the neighbor. Lydia was always overly chatty, but today her message was short, cryptic even. Saw Gareth around again last night. Looked off. Everything okay? Imogen frowned, her heart skipping a beat. Lydia's curiosity bordered on nosy, but her instincts were usually spot on. Imogen texted back a vague reassurance, but her hands shook as she did. What had Lydia seen? And what did she mean by looked off? The rest of the night was a blur. Gareth returned hours later, his mood distant and curt. Evie remained locked in her room. Imogen's unease grew, but she pushed it down, unwilling to confront the thoughts that haunted her. The cracks were widening, and she knew, deep down, that something unspeakable was about to break through. The unsettling atmosphere in the Mercer household deepened in the days that followed. Imogen moved through her home, as if surrounded by invisible ghosts. Evie, withdrawn and isolated, rarely left her room, while Gareth's behavior grew increasingly erratic. The tension between them was palpable, and the walls of the house seemed to hum with a quiet, ominous energy. Imogen couldn't shake the feeling that her family was teetering on the edge of something dark, something dangerous. Evie spent most of her time behind the closed door of her bedroom, consumed by whatever art projects she was working on. What had once been a source of pride for Imogen, Evie's creative independence, had now become a reason for concern. The girl who had once been so vibrant, so full of life, had grown pale and withdrawn. Dark circles hung under her eyes, and there was a haunted look in her gaze that made Imogen's heart ache. Gareth, on the other hand, seemed to be losing himself in his own thoughts, retreating into a strange, detached state. He lingered in the house more often, spending long hours in his study or pacing the hallways late at night. His presence near Evie's door, standing silently, as if waiting for something, filled Imogen with a growing sense of dread. She could feel the tension between them, something far more sinister than the typical friction between a stepfather and stepdaughter. Unable to ignore the gnawing unease any longer, Imogen found herself drawn to Gareth's study one evening when he was out. The room, usually so meticulously organized, was now in disarray. Papers lay scattered across his desk, and the air felt heavy with the weight of something unspoken. As she sifted through the mess, Imogen's fingers brushed against a notebook she had never seen before. Opening it, she was met with page after page of Gareth's handwriting. At first, the notes seemed innocent enough, work-related details, reminders, and sketches. But as she flipped through the pages, the writing became increasingly erratic. Phrases like, "Can't stop thinking about her," and "What if she leaves?" filled the margins, the words growing darker with each page. A recurring line appeared over and over. "She has to stay with me." The realization hit her like a physical blow. Gareth's thoughts were fixated on Evie, in a way that went beyond concern or frustration. His writing was filled with desperation and obsession, and the darker implications of his feelings settled in Imogen's mind with horrifying clarity. She slammed the notebook shut, her hands trembling. This was no longer a situation of simple tension between family members. Something much darker and more dangerous had taken root in Gareth's mind. Imogen left the study, her pulse racing, trying to steady her breathing. The house, once her refuge, now felt suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in around her. She needed to confront Evie, to warn her, but the words wouldn't come. How could she explain what she had just uncovered without tearing their lives apart? That night, as Imogen lay in bed, she couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every soft noise in the hallway set her nerves on edge. At one point, she heard soft footsteps outside her door, the familiar sound of Gareth moving through the house. His footsteps stopped in front of Evie's room, and the door creaked open, just enough for Imogen to hear it from her room. Fear tightened around her chest, but she remained still, listening. Gareth lingered by Evie's door for what felt like an eternity before retreating back down the hall. Imogen's heart pounded in her ears, the darkness around her closing in. She knew something was terribly wrong, but she couldn't bring herself to confront it, and not yet. The next morning, the tension in the house was palpable. Evie's dinner plate, left outside her room the night before, remained untouched. Imogen's heart ached with worry, but when she knocked on Evie's door, there was no response. Evie's silence was suffocating, a wall that Imogen could not breach. As she stood there, her phone buzzed with a message from Lydia Westfield, their neighbor, who had grown increasingly concerned over the past few weeks. Lydia's message was brief, but unsettling, mentioning that she had seen Gareth near the house late the night before, looking off as she put it. Imogen's hands shook as she read the message. She knew she had to do something, but fear paralyzed her. She couldn't bring herself to confront Gareth, and the thought of talking to Evie only filled her with dread. The truth she had uncovered was too horrifying to face head-on. The days blurred together, each one marked by the same oppressive silence. Gareth continued his strange behavior, growing more distant and evasive, while Evie retreated further into herself. Imogen felt as if she was walking on the edge of a precipice, one wrong step away from disaster. She spent more time away from the house, driving aimlessly through the streets of Wildwood, trying to escape the darkness that had settled over her life. Then one evening, everything changed. Imogen had just returned home from work, her thoughts clouded with the same dread that had haunted her for days. As she stepped inside the house, she heard a crash from upstairs, followed by a muffled sound that made her blood run cold. Heart pounding, she rushed toward the stairs, knowing instinctively that the noise had come from Evie's room. Reaching Evie's door, Imogen found it locked. She pounded on the door, calling out for her daughter, but there was no response. Panic surged through her, and without thinking, she ran to the kitchen to retrieve the spare key. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the lock, adrenaline surging through her veins. When the door finally swung open, Imogen froze at the sight before her. The room was a wreck. Evie's art supplies were scattered across the floor, her canvas overturned, and the atmosphere in the room was thick with tension. Gareth stood in the center of the chaos, his face twisted with an expression Imogen barely recognized. Evie was on the floor, her back against the wall, tears streaming down her face. Her entire body trembled with fear. Imogen's mind reeled as she took in the scene. Gareth's presence felt menacing, his fists clenched and his body rigid with anger. He stood over Evie, the air between them charged with something dark and twisted. For a moment, no one moved. The silence was suffocating, as if the room itself had been drained of oxygen. Then slowly, Gareth turned to face Imogen. His eyes were wild, filled with a cold, unrecognizable fury. The truth of what had been simmering beneath the surface all these weeks, perhaps even months, was now laid bare before her. Imogen could see the twisted obsession in his gaze, the darkness that had taken hold of him. The family she had tried so hard to hold together was shattering before her eyes. The days following the scene in Evie's room were a blur for Imogen. Time seemed to slip through her fingers as the reality of what had happened began to sink in. The house, once a place of comfort and warmth, now felt like a prison. Every room, every corner, haunted by the tension that had erupted that night. Imogen found herself constantly on edge, as if any moment could trigger another outburst, another revelation of just how twisted things had become under her own roof. Evie, after that terrible night, retreated further into her isolation. She barely left her room, and when she did, she moved through the house like a ghost, her face pale and her eyes hollow. The light that had once made her so vibrant, so full of life, was gone. Imogen watched her daughter with growing fear, knowing that something inside her had broken, and it was far beyond a simple rift between stepfather and stepdaughter. But Gareth was another story. After the incident, he had become disturbingly calm. His demeanor had shifted, almost as if nothing had happened at all. He went about his days with an eerie sense of normalcy, barely acknowledging the events that had shaken their household. He was distant, yes, but it was a kind of calculated distance, as if he was watching and waiting, plotting his next move. Imogen could feel his eyes on her, on Evie, every time they crossed paths in the house. It was as if he was daring them to challenge him, daring them to bring the dark truth to the surface. Imogen had thought about going to the police, about telling them what she had found, what she had witnessed, but she stopped herself every time. What would she even say? That she had found disturbing writings in her husband's notebook, that she had seen him standing over her daughter, filled with a rage she could barely understand. There was no proof, no hard evidence that could tie Gareth to anything beyond strange behavior, and Imogen knew that once she opened that door, there would be no going back. Lydia Westfield continued to check in on her through texts, her concern evident in every message. Lydia had always been perceptive, noticing things that others didn't, and Imogen had no doubt that she suspected something far worse than what Imogen had let on. But how could she explain the situation to anyone? How could she admit that her husband had become obsessed with her daughter, that the family she had worked so hard to build was crumbling under the weight of something unspeakable? It wasn't until a week later that things took a darker turn. Imogen had been out of the house for most of the day, taking on extra work at the clinic to avoid the suffocating tension at home. When she returned that evening, the house was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that made her skin prickle with unease. She set her keys down on the kitchen counter and moved through the house, calling out for Evie, but there was no response. Her heart began to race as she climbed the stairs, her feet moving faster with every step. She reached Evie's door, the same door she had unlocked in a panic days ago, and knocked softly. When there was no answer, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty, the bed was unmade, art supplies scattered haphazardly across the floor, but there wasn't a sign of Evie. Imogen's breath caught in her throat as she moved further into the room, her mind racing. Where could she have gone? Why hadn't she told Imogen where she was going? Then she saw it, a single sheet of paper resting on Evie's desk, the edges curling slightly as if it had been there for hours. Imogen's hands trembled as she picked it up, her eyes scanning the words written in Evie's familiar, slanted handwriting. It wasn't much, just a few lines, but the weight of them crashed down on Imogen like a wave. "I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry, Mom. I need to get away. I need to escape him." The words burned into her mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. Escape him. Imogen's blood ran cold as she realized what Evie meant. This wasn't just about Gareth's strange behavior anymore. Evie was running. She had fled, leaving behind a cryptic note and a shattered mother who could only piece together the terrifying truth. Imogen's first instinct was to call the police, to alert them that her daughter was missing, but she hesitated. There was no telling what Gareth would do if he found out she had involved the authorities. She couldn't risk it, not yet. She needed to find Evie herself, to bring her home before Gareth could make things worse. But how? Evie could be anywhere. Imogen's mind raced as she tried to think of where her daughter might have gone. Maybe to a friend's house, maybe to one of her art professors at the college. Imogen's hand shook as she grabbed her phone, scrolling through her contacts and calling anyone who might know where Evie had gone. No one had seen her. The hours stretched on, and the house felt more suffocating with each passing minute. Imogen paced the floors, her heart racing, her mind spiraling into worst-case scenarios. Where was Evie? And why hadn't she said something sooner? Why hadn't she told Imogen just how bad things had gotten with Gareth? As the night dragged on, Imogen couldn't stay in the house any longer. She grabbed her coat and keys, barely pausing to lock the door behind her, as she drove aimlessly through the streets of Wildwood. She searched the places Evie used to frequent, the small park where she would sketch in the mornings, the library where she spent hours lost in art books, the coffee shop she loved. But Evie was nowhere to be found. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning, when exhaustion finally overtook her, that Imogen returned home, defeated. The house once again was eerily silent. She crept up the stairs, hoping against hope that Evie had returned in her absence. But the sight of the empty bed in her daughter's room crushed what little hope she had left. Imogen didn't sleep that night. She sat in the living room, staring at the clock, her mind consumed by thoughts of where Evie could be. The note, crumpled in her hand, felt like a physical weight, a constant reminder that her daughter was out there, somewhere, alone and afraid. And then, just before dawn, the phone rang. Imogen's heart leapt into her throat as she answered, her voice barely a whisper. It wasn't Evie on the other end, it was the police. A body had been found just outside of town, near the old railway tracks. The officer's voice was calm, measured, but Imogen could hear the weight of the words behind them. They needed her to come in. They needed her to identify the body. Imogen felt the world shift beneath her, as if the ground itself was falling away. She knew, before she even hung up the phone, that her worst fears had come true. Evie was gone. Imogen's world shattered the moment she arrived at the police station. The officers were kind, their voices soft, but nothing could dull the sharp edge of reality that she now had to face. They led her into a small, sterile room with fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead. The atmosphere felt cold, detached, and Imogen could already feel her legs growing weak. The officer, Detective Raymond Stokes, a seasoned investigator with salt and pepper hair and a tired look in his eyes, asked her to take a seat. His face was grim as he explained the process. There was no delicate way to put it. A body had been found near the old railway tracks just outside town, and although it was badly beaten, initial identification suggested that it might be Evie. Imogen barely registered the words. She was numb, her mind struggling to grasp the enormity of what was happening. The detective's words blurred together as he continued, something about how the body had been discovered by a passerby early in the morning, near a secluded part of the woods. They had found no signs of a struggle, no indication that anyone had witnessed what had happened. But the body, Imogen could barely bring herself to think of it that way, matched Evie's description. They took her down to the morgue, where the cold air hit her like a slap to the face. The moment they lifted the sheet, the last remnants of hope dissolved. Imogen gasped, the air leaving her lungs in a single wrenching moment. There was no doubt. It was Evie, her beautiful daughter, so full of potential and life. now reduced to this cold, lifeless form. Imogen's legs gave out, and she collapsed into the chair behind her, her mind barely able to comprehend the sight in front of her. She couldn't bring herself to touch Evie, to acknowledge the finality of it. Her body shook with sobs she couldn't release, the grief too deep and raw to even find a voice. The world had shifted, and nothing would ever be the same again. After what felt like an eternity, they led Imogen back to the small conference room, where Detective Stokes waited for her with a cup of water. He allowed her a moment of silence before he began asking questions that Imogen could barely process, let alone answer. Had Evie been acting strangely before she disappeared? Had there been any trouble at home? Was there anyone she had spoken to recently? Anyone who might have been involved in her life in ways Imogen hadn't known? Imogen answered as best she could, her words coming out in stilted fragments. She told them about the note she had found, about Evie's increasing isolation, and about her own suspicions surrounding Gareth. But as she spoke, a horrible realization began to creep over her. Gareth wasn't here. He hadn't been there when the police had called. He hadn't come with her to identify Evie's body. Imogen had been so consumed by her own grief and shock that she hadn't even thought to ask where he was. And now, as she sat in that cold, sterile room, a sickening feeling began to build in the pit of her stomach. Where was Gareth? Detective Stokes picked up on her unease and began asking more pointed questions about Gareth's behavior. Imogen found herself telling him about the notebook she had discovered, about the strange, obsessive writings, and about the scene in Evie's room just days before. She told him everything, the words spilling out in a flood of anxiety and fear. The detective's expression hardened as he listened, and when Imogen had finished, he leaned back in his chair, considering everything she had said. He didn't say much, only that they would need to investigate further. They would need to speak to Gareth. Imogen returned home later that evening, the house feeling colder and more oppressive than ever. Every room felt like it was closing in on her, and the silence was unbearable. She tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw Evie's face, her lifeless body lying on that cold slab in the morgue. The grief was overwhelming, like a physical weight pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. The next morning, the police arrived to search the house. Imogen had given them permission to look for anything that might connect Gareth to Evie's disappearance and death. She stood in the doorway, watching as they moved through the rooms with quiet efficiency, bagging evidence, taking photographs. The notebook, still tucked away in Gareth's desk, was the first thing they seized. Hours passed, and by the time the police left, Imogen felt like a stranger in her own home. Every corner of the house felt tainted, touched by the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. She couldn't even bring herself to go into Evie's room. It remained exactly as it had been the last time she had seen her daughter, chaotic, full of half-finished art projects, the remnants of a life cut short. Later that evening, the police returned with more questions. They had tracked Gareth's movements in the days leading up to Evie's death, and what they had uncovered only deepened Imogen's horror. Gareth hadn't been at work as he had claimed. He had been seen near the old railway tracks on more than one occasion in the exact area where Evie's body had been found. The police had also spoken to Lydia Westfield, the neighbor who had been keeping a close eye on the Mercers for weeks. Lydia confirmed that she had seen Gareth leaving the house late at night several times in the days leading up to Evie's disappearance. She had noticed his odd behavior, his obsession with Evie, but hadn't known the full extent of what was happening. Imogen's heart sank as the pieces began to fall into place. The weight of everything she had suspected, everything she had feared, was now crashing down on her with brutal clarity. Gareth had been involved in Evie's death. There was no other explanation. His obsession with her had spiraled out of control, and when Evie had tried to escape, he had followed her, ensuring that she could never leave him. The investigation into Gareth's involvement intensified in the days that followed. The police found more evidence connecting him to Evie's disappearance, financial records, phone logs, and more disturbing journal entries that revealed the depth of his obsession. It was clear that Gareth had been planning something for weeks, maybe even months. He had manipulated Evie, cornered her in her own home, and when she had finally tried to break free, he had killed her. The day they arrested Gareth, Imogen watched from the front porch as the police led him out of the house in handcuffs. His face was expressionless, his eyes dark and empty. He didn't look at her as they put him in the car. There was no anger, no regret, only a cold, detached emptiness that made Imogen's skin crawl. As the car pulled away, Imogen stood in the cold autumn air, her body trembling. The man she had once loved, the man she had trusted with her life and her daughter's life, was gone, but so was Evie. And no amount of justice, no prison sentence, could ever bring her back. The weeks following Gareth's arrest felt like an eternity for Imogen. The trial loomed ahead, casting a long shadow over her already broken life. Each day seemed to blur into the next, filled with meetings with lawyers, endless questions from the police, and the weight of her grief that refused to lift. The world outside her window continued to move forward, but for Imogen, time had stopped the moment they had taken Gareth away. The community of Wildwood was in shock. The quiet suburban town, once a peaceful haven, had been rocked by the revelation of what had transpired within the Mercer household. Neighbors whispered as Imogen walked by, their curiosity barely masked behind sympathetic glances. But no amount of sympathy could heal the hole that had been left in her heart by the loss of Evie, and no amount of justice could erase the horror of discovering that Gareth, the man she had trusted for years, had been capable of such a monstrous act. The day of the trial arrived with an air of grim anticipation. The courtroom was packed with reporters, spectators, and legal teams, all eager to witness the unraveling of the tragic tale that had captivated the small town. Imogen sat in the front row, her hands clenched tightly in her lap as she stared straight ahead, refusing to meet the eyes of the onlookers. She had become a reluctant spectacle, the grieving mother of a murdered daughter, thrust into the spotlight by circumstances beyond her control. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. They painted Gareth as a manipulative man who had become obsessed with his stepdaughter, whose desires had twisted into something dark and destructive. The letters, the journal entries, the evidence from the crime scene, all of it painted a picture of a man who had slowly lost his grip on reality, consumed by his need to control and possess Evie. Imogen listened in silence as the prosecutor described Gareth's descent into obsession, her stomach churning with each new revelation. The notebook she had found in his study had been only the tip of the iceberg. Gareth's fixation on Evie had been growing for months, perhaps even years, and his behavior had become increasingly erratic. He had tracked her movements, monitored her interactions, and tried to isolate her from everyone around her. When Evie had finally realized the depth of his obsession and attempted to flee, Gareth had snapped. The police had found more damning evidence in the weeks leading up to the trial. Financial records showed that Gareth had been planning an escape, setting aside money in a hidden account, money he had intended to use to take Evie away, far from Wildwood, far from Imogen. His plan had been meticulous, but when Evie had discovered it and rejected him, Gareth's carefully constructed fantasy had collapsed. The police believed that it was in that moment, in the face of rejection, that Gareth had followed Evie to the old railway tracks and killed her. Imogen sat through the prosecution's case in a numb haze, each new piece of evidence twisting the knife in her chest a little deeper. She had always known that Gareth's obsession with Evie had been dangerous, but hearing the full extent of it laid out in such clinical detail was almost too much to bear. The weight of guilt pressed down on her with crushing force. Guilt that she hadn't seen the signs sooner, guilt that she hadn't protected her daughter. The defense, however, tried to paint a different picture. Gareth's lawyer argued that he had been suffering from mental illness, that his actions had been the result of a mind unraveling under the pressure of grief, stress, and untreated trauma. They argued that Gareth had not been in control of his actions when he killed Evie, that his obsession had been born out of a deep-seated psychological disorder that had gone untreated for too long. Imogen felt sick as she listened to the defense's arguments. They were trying to frame Gareth as a victim of his own mind, a man who had been pushed to the brink by forces beyond his control. But Imogen knew the truth. She had seen the cold, calculated way Gareth had manipulated Evie, how he had used his position of trust to prey on her vulnerabilities. This wasn't the act of a man who had lost control. This was the act of a man who had deliberately, methodically destroyed her daughter's life. The trial dragged on for weeks, each day filled with more painful details, more evidence of the twisted relationship between Gareth and Evie. The prosecution called witnesses, Evie's friends, teachers, and neighbors, each of whom testified to the changes they had seen in her in the months leading up to her death. They described how Evie had become increasingly withdrawn, how she had stopped attending social events, how she had seemed frightened, even paranoid, in her final days. All signs, they argued, that Gareth's obsession had been tightening its grip around her, suffocating her until there was no escape. But it was the forensic evidence that sealed Gareth's fate. The blood spatter analysis, the fingerprints on the murder weapon, the tire tracks found near the railway tracks, all of it pointed directly to Gareth. The prosecution's case was airtight, and as the weeks wore on, it became clear that there would be no escaping the truth. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury was sent to deliberate. Imogen sat in the courtroom, her heart pounding as the hours dragged on. She had waited so long for this moment, for justice for Evie, but now that it was here, she felt nothing but emptiness. No matter what the jury decided, Evie was gone. Nothing could change that. The jury deliberated for 2 long days before finally returning to the courtroom. Imogen's breath caught in her throat as the foreman stood to deliver the verdict. The room was silent, every eye on the jury box, every person holding their breath. "Guilty," the foreman said, his voice ringing out in the tense silence. "Guilty of first-degree murder." The words echoed in Imogen's mind, but she felt no relief. Gareth had been found guilty, and he would spend the rest of his life in prison, but it didn't bring Evie back. The victory felt hollow, like a Pyrrhic triumph in a war that had already cost her everything. In the days that followed the trial, life in Wildwood slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The media frenzy faded, and the town moved on from the tragedy that had once gripped it so tightly. But for Imogen, there was no moving on. The house that had once been her sanctuary was now filled with ghosts. Every room, every hallway was a reminder of what she had lost. She thought about leaving, about selling the house, and starting over somewhere new. But where would she go? The weight of the grief, the guilt, would follow her no matter where she went. She had failed Evie, and that failure would haunt her for the rest of her life. For weeks, Imogen wandered through the house like a specter, barely eating, barely sleeping. Her life had been torn apart, and now there was nothing left. Gareth was in prison, but even that didn't bring closure. The man she had once loved, the man she had trusted, had taken everything from her. One evening, as the sun set over Wildwood, Imogen found herself standing in front of Evie's bedroom door. She hadn't been able to bring herself to enter the room since Evie's death. But now, for some reason, she felt drawn to it. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob, turning it slowly and pushing the door open. The room was exactly as Evie had left it. The art supplies were scattered across the floor, the unfinished sketches taped to the walls. It felt frozen in time, as if Evie might walk through the door at any moment. But she wouldn't. Evie was gone, and all that remained were the fragments of the life she had left behind. Imogen walked over to the desk, her fingers tracing the edges of the paper Evie had been working on. A lump formed in her throat as she picked up one of the sketches, a delicate drawing of a bird in flight, its wings spread wide, as if reaching for the sky. It was unfinished, like so much of Evie's life. As the tears finally came, Imogen allowed herself to grieve. The trial was over, but the pain would never fully fade. All she could do now was try to pick up the pieces of her life, to find some way to live in the aftermath of the storm that had destroyed everything. In the weeks following the trial, the silence in Imogen's house became a heavy, oppressive presence. The echoes of everything that had transpired, the lies, the obsession, the tragedy, seemed to fill every corner, every shadow. Life outside continued as usual. The town of Wildwood resumed its normal rhythm, but for Imogen, nothing felt the same. The trial had ended, but her internal trial had only just begun. Each day felt like an insurmountable challenge. She would wake in the morning, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how she was supposed to go on. The moments of numbness were fleeting, and the sharp pain of loss cut through them like jagged glass. Evie was gone, and every morning was a reminder that her daughter's laughter, her art, her presence, had been erased from the world. Gareth, too, was gone, not physically, but his betrayal and the dark secrets he had hidden had destroyed any remnants of the love she once felt for him. Imogen found herself wandering through the house aimlessly, each room a painful reminder of what once was. Evie's art supplies remained untouched in her room. The sketches, unfinished projects, and colors now seemed like relics of a life stolen too soon. The rest of the house felt like a museum of memories, filled with objects that no longer held meaning. The community around her had returned to its normal pace. But there was a shift. The neighbors, once familiar faces who would stop by with small talk, now offered quiet sympathy from a distance. Lydia Westfield still checked in occasionally, but the conversations were short and awkward. Imogen couldn't bring herself to talk about what had happened. It was too raw, too personal, and the whispers, though not as loud as before, still lingered in the background. The tragedy of Evie's death had become a story, an event that the town would eventually move on from, but one that Imogen could never escape. Gareth's sentencing had brought legal closure, but it hadn't provided the peace Imogen had desperately hoped for. He had been sentenced to life in prison without parole, a punishment that felt fitting, yet somehow hollow. The man who had torn her life apart was behind bars, but the damage he had done would never be undone. Imogen found herself thinking about him in brief, painful flashes, the way he had once held her hand, the way he had smiled at her across the dinner table. It was hard to reconcile those memories with the monster she now knew he had become. Those memories only served to deepen the feeling of betrayal. Imogen stayed away from the public eye as much as she could. Even simple errands became exhausting, as she couldn't stand the pity in people's eyes, the way they would lower their voices when they saw her. She felt like an outsider in her own life, disconnected from the world around her. Her grief was a constant companion, a weight that sat on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The one place where she found any semblance of peace was in nature. The hiking trails outside of Wildwood, once a refuge for her during simpler times, now offered her a space to think, to grieve without the prying eyes of the town. She would spend hours walking through the woods, the crisp mountain air offering her some relief from the suffocating atmosphere of her home. The trees, tall and silent, seemed to absorb her pain, allowing her to release it, if only for a little while. During these walks, Imogen would think about Evie, about the bright future her daughter had deserved, the dreams she had been working toward. Evie had always been so full of life, so full of passion for her art and her dreams. Imogen would remember the way Evie would sit for hours, completely absorbed in her latest sketch or painting, her brow furrowed in concentration. She remembered the way her daughter's face would light up when she finished a piece, the pride that would shine in her eyes. Those memories were bittersweet now, filled with the ache of knowing there would be no more new sketches, no more proud smiles. Imogen also thought about Gareth, but those thoughts were harder to process. She found herself questioning everything. How had she not seen the signs? How had she missed the darkness growing inside him? There were moments, small flashes in the early days of their marriage, when she had sensed something off, but she had dismissed them. She had told herself that every marriage had its ups and downs, that Gareth's aloofness was just part of his nature. Now she wondered if those moments had been warning signs she had ignored, red flags that might have saved Evie, if only she had paid closer attention. One evening, several months after the trial, Imogen received a letter from Gareth. She had been avoiding any contact with him, refusing to visit him in prison, refusing to acknowledge the letters he had sent before. But this one felt different. He had written it himself, not through his lawyer, and the envelope was plain, with no return address. Against her better judgment, she opened it. The letter was short, but its contents chilled her to the bone. Gareth didn't ask for forgiveness, nor did he admit any guilt. Instead, he wrote about Evie, about how he had loved her, how he had been misunderstood. His words were delusional, twisted, painting his actions as some perverse form of love. Imogen's hands shook as she read the letter, her stomach turning as the words seemed to mock her, reminding her of the nightmare that had destroyed her family. She crumpled the letter and threw it into the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed the paper, turning it to ash. But the words remained burned into her mind, a reminder that Gareth's obsession had not ended with his imprisonment. Even behind bars, he still held power over her, over Evie's memory. That realization filled her with a renewed sense of anger at Gareth, at herself, at the world that had allowed this to happen. In the days that followed, Imogen made a decision. She couldn't change what had happened. She couldn't bring Evie back, but she could make sure that her daughter's memory wasn't defined by the tragedy that had taken her life. Imogen began working on a project, one that would honor Evie's love for art. She reached out to the local college, where Evie had been studying, and proposed the idea of setting up a scholarship in Evie's name, one that would support young artists like her daughter, giving them the chance to pursue their dreams. It was a small step, but it felt like the right one. Imogen threw herself into the project, meeting with professors and local benefactors, working to create something meaningful out of the wreckage of her life. The scholarship, when it was finally established, brought a sense of purpose back into her life. It didn't erase the pain, but it gave her a reason to keep going. As the first year of the scholarship program drew to a close, Imogen attended the ceremony for the inaugural recipients. Standing in front of the small group of students, she spoke about Evie, about her passion for art, her creativity, her spirit. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Imogen felt a sense of peace. Evie's memory would live on, not through the tragedy of her death, but through the lives she would continue to inspire. The story has been edited to ensure personal privacy and security regarding names and locations. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe to see the latest and most thrilling family crime stories.